Hello everyone. Haggard et al.'s article. So I met in person Stephen Haggard, when he visited in Korea, and David Kang. I met him when I was in Texas in person, and I don't know about Moon. And I was really surprised how Stephen Haggard deeply understands the Korean politics, maybe more than Koreans sometimes. I was really surprised. And then David Kang, he wrote a lot of books, and he had very deep understanding of North Korea as well. We also read David Kang's book book chapter later on. So we'll meet Kang again. Anyway, so I don't know how you felt after reading this, and then but I wanted to emphasize at least one thing, that is this article actually show how to write, critique articles. So he or they actually like wrote the main arguments of the revisionists, that's their colonialism actually help or necessary condition for Korean economic development. And then they actually shows the evidence, counter evidence, that you are completely wrong, and then why. So this article actually should talk more, because they have to show like main argument, and they have to show like evidence to to uh, to criticize the revisionists. So I like this article a lot, not just because of their argument itself, but how to write the articles. It actually the textbook. Let's start with the revisionist argument. So they emphasize revisionist within three sentences. The first sentence is the Japanese transformed a relatively corrupt and effective traditional state into a modern developmental one capable of simultaneously controlling and transforming Korean society. That's argument number one. And then based on this argument, actually, it assumes that the Korean traditional state, as Arthur Coley mentioned, it was very corrupted and then ineffective, right? But developmental state, we didn't go it yet, so we didn't talk about what is Korean development state, but it, it assumes, based on this sentence, very capable, have a huge capacity to do something, and then also very strong, right? And can control things, and very effective and anti-corrupt maybe. So that's the things that about development state. So development state seems very good things, right? Compared to E state, the Joseon E state. And the second argument is Japanese established a pattern of business government relations that facilitate industrial both through its influence on formation, the Korean private sector, and as a development model. So the first one is the state itself, and the second one is business relationship, right? So how they uh, develop their businesses, Koreans, right? The colonial bureaucracy effected a fundamental transformation of social relations that create a framework for e- evolution of a high growth political economy. So that's the three sentences. So state itself, business, the economy, and society. The three things. So let's talk about their arguments. So they started with the economic growth first, and I was really surprised. If you look at the data, this is economic growth. So this is I already give you the I already give you the article, right? So this is the first table number one. But I actually wanted to see not only this but also like the growth rate. But I don't think this is growth rate, right? The distribution of net commodity product by industrial origin. So agriculture and fishery, mining, manufacturing. So from 1910 to 15. But the important thing that he is mentioning is that the number of agricultural growth has been exaggerated by the Arthur Coyle. So Arthur Coyle is saying talk about like rice production, right? But he's saying that if you look at the page 869, the agricultural depression of 1920s to be much deeper. So there was a depression period, and then they saying that not. I mean, he the Arthur Coley's argument. If you look at the Arthur Coley's argument, the Arthur Coley is talking about there was high rice productivity growth during the Japanese colonialism. Not only high growth rate in Japanese colonialism, but also it linked to the development state. That's how it should be, right? So for Arthur Cooley to argue that there was a link between the Japanese colonial period to the development state, there must be continuity. I mean, this article is keep talking about continuity and discontinuity, and then the Helgard et al. Talking about that, but there is no continuity because of post-war and then regime change kind of things. But Arthur Coyle said there was continuity, but the Helgard et al. Actually emphasized that. I mean, even during the colonialism period, there was no economic growth or no high productivity growth in terms of rice and other things. Why is that? The first thing is agricultural depression. There was agricultural depression of 1920s. The price of rice was severely depressed in empire during 1919 to 1922 and again 1926 to 1933. So there was a rice productivity growth, the 1.5, but that is even exaggerated. But that's the Helgard Arrow's argument. And the Japanese made very little effort to increase productivity in non-rice crops, despite the fact that these crops constantly accounted for 40% of total agricultural output. And the second argument is this. So the first one saying like, oh, you are talking about Arthur Coley talking about rice productivity growth. Well, okay, I'll look at rice productivity growth. And then, oh, it's exaggerated because there was a huge depression. And then Arthur Coley only talking about when there was a good phase. So when there was good time, and he calculate only that time. But if you look at overall, then overall productivity never good. And the second thing he didn't mention about non-rice crops. So rice matters a lot in Korean society, and then at the time even more. But 40% of total agricultural output is not rice crops, so other things. But he didn't mention it, and the Japanese made little effort to increase productivity in non-rice crops. So only 6% the rice is accounted for, only 60%. And then, but if you look at like overall productivity growth is negative for all the 1920s, so it's minus 0.2%, and it turned positive in 1.2% in the first half of the 1930s, but it's again negative minus 0.3 in the second half of the 1930s. So there was no productivity growth in agriculture during 1920 to 39, even decline if we compare 1920 to 1944. So their argument showing that actually if you look at the data more carefully, then you can see that at first maybe there was a rice productivity growth. So if you make a mean, maybe it looks very good. But if you look at like from 1920s, but there was a high depression in terms of the agricultural sector, and then during those days it was minus. And then so it's completely wrong. I mean, it can't argue that the Japanese colonialism brought about economic growth in terms of agricultural productivity growth. And Japanese emphasize on extracting agricultural surplus and diverting into export. So this is one the reason the even though, so let's say like as Arthur Coley argues, so let's say like Japanese contribute to rice productivity growth, but it doesn't benefit to South Koreans per se, because the Japanese emphasize on extracting an agricultural surplus and diverting to exports. So they use this rice production for exports. So it doesn't go, or it doesn't benefit to South Korea. So that's the another criticism, right? And then the real average farm income changed little during 1915 to 37. Real wage for agricultural labor declined, and consumption of major staple foods and caloric intake from them fell. So that means like Koreans suffer more. So it if if there is rice productivity growth rate has been increased, but if it doesn't go to the South Koreans, so what is good about economic growth, right? That's the what Hegat et al. Wanted to actually argue, right? And post-war pattern of agricultural development in Korea bear no resemblance to the colonial one. I wanted to actually talk about this for sure. I mean, we will have a chance to talk about it. So post-war pattern of agricultural development in Korea, and if you compare colonial ones, there was no resemblance. It's not same at all. Number one, and to extractive export-oriented colonial model of development. So before the rice was used for Japanese to extract export oriented, right? And then number two, agricultural performance in post-war period was distinctly superior to the pre-war period in every regard. During the 1953 to 1969, growth increased to 4.33%, almost 50% higher than colonial growth. So if it is true, so Haggard wanted to actually emphasize this. The pattern has changed. Koreans did not use this rice production or rice productivity for export. They use for inward consumption. So that means Koreans should eat rice. They do not want to export, right? So even now we do not export rice at all. We just eat as we want it. So that's it. So this is the different pattern for sure. And then second is, after you went out, after you left, even growth increased more. That means uh, Japanese colonialism did not use our land even more properly, right? So they should developed it. They should have developed it better, right? But they didn't, or they couldn't. So it is maybe because not their land, even though they work hard, it didn't make them rich, or it didn't make them uh, full. So maybe Koreans, they did not work harder than other colonialization countries or not. We never know, but this is the actually the data that show, even like from 1953 to 1969, Korea wasn't even rich at all. So the Korean development started in 1960s. So maybe, I mean, but if you compare like 4.33% to 1.5, so 4.33% is much higher, right? And then let's look at industrialization policy. So the second thing that Arthur Coyle wanted to emphasize is industrialization growth. So from 1914 to 1918, the industry grew rapidly, and then he wanted to actually explain that during 1915 to 18, industry grew real rapidly is because there is no base whatsoever. So that means, let's say, like, if you're really poor, then it's a lot easier to have economic growth because it's zero. So it's from 0 to 50, it's easy to achieve. But if you are like 50, then it's not easy to be from 50 to like 60. It's much harder. That's why you were saying. So it was zero base. So that's why there was a rapid industry growth. It's very natural. So like there was none. I mean, there was no industry whatsoever. But if you have like established one farm, let's say, then it's like 100%. Like in terms of growth rate, it's a lot. So that's why from 1914 to 1918 there was industry grew rapidly, and from 1918 to 31st, the industry experienced a long-term period of slow growth. So that's what he wanted to mention. So if you look at like this is composition manufacturing output percentage share. So which one is the highest percentage? So food is the highest, right? And textile, metals, machinery, ceramics, chemicals, lumber, wood, printing, food, others. So food is number one, and metal number two, right? So textile industry. So if you look at the compositions was like that in 1914. So this means the Korean society is quite agricultural society. But if you look at 1920s, the chemicals became number one. So if you look at the data here, so 44.5%, and food is 38%, and textile and metals, machinery, ceramics like this, but it increased. So if you look at like compositions, then you can tell the composition has been changed. In 1925, if you look at year, then again food number one. 1930 food number one, and chemicals has been decreased in terms of composition. And 1935 food again, but its metals has been increased, textile has been increased, right? So textile from like 1925 it increased significantly. And so he's saying that this is true. This is true that Korea has been industrialized to some extent. But he emphasized that energy, natural resource intensive heavy industry in Korea as a component of its post 1931 push to Manchuria. What does that mean? The Japan wanted to expand its land, so they started a war against China, right? And they started to expand, but since they were in war, so they wanted to have more energy, natural resources, heavy industry things, and then where this come from? So he's saying that the Haggard arrow saying, yes, they maybe contribute some industrialization, but where this industrialization go, it goes to Manchuria. So to expansion. So one of it used for the expansions for the Japanese colonialism. It doesn't go to or it doesn't contribute to the Koreans' development. And number two, the say again the industrialization. So the Japanese owned 58.6% of all farms in Korea. So the Arthur Coyle argues that like the Koreans started to small scale enterprises, and then many Koreans started to own its business. So he's saying that like yeah, that's true. So Japanese owned 80 about like 60%, let's say that 40% goes to Koreans, right? But yeah, but he's saying you have to see like where money come from. So Japanese investors accounted for 90.9%, so about 91% of all paid capital, especially in capital intensive heavy industries, chemicals, metals, machinery. So this actually he wanted to say that like you have to specify where the industrial, where what kind of farms Korea could own. But if like Koreans could own like very important like industrialization, like industry like metal, machineries, chemicals, maybe after the war Koreans have techniques, right? So you need technique for to own this kind of farms. But if you look at the data, then usually like very important industries were owned by the Japanese people. So if you look at here, I think that 58.6% of all farms in Korea. I think I did something wrong, right? Don't you think? If you look at table number 5, so this is page, what page I got? First, it is important to underline the high degree of concentration of ownership in industry. 1941, Japanese owned 80, about 60% of all firms in Korea. The number was a joint venture form. The Japanese investors account. I didn't write wrong. Okay, so I want you to see number 5, table number 5, Korean and Japanese ownership. 1940 by percentage and paid in capital. So if you look at the percentage, only machineries, Koreans own 42%, and metal, so most of them were Japanese, right? But printing and publishing, Koreans 43%, lumber and wood 10%, textiles 15%. But if you look at the most important actually the infrastructure for a country to develop, we need to have a electricity and gas, right? And chemicals, machinery kind of things. But except for machinery, electricity and gas, ceramics, chemicals, these are kind of heavy industry. And heavy industry, you need skilled labor, and that means if you have skilled labor, then you can actually manage that, right? So this means that Koreans were never allowed to have very important industry in Korean industrialization. That means the Japanese could own very important industries such as metal, machinery, chemicals, and electricity and gases. And Korea noted that the South was beneficiary of the fact that it housed the lion's share of the textile and food processing industries, as well as machine and tool industry. So he wanted to emphasize that how South Korea could develop while North Korea couldn't develop. So he's saying like South Korea was lucky because they could share more in like textile and food processing industries, machine and tool industry. But if you look at the data, it's actually completely lie. So this is table number 6, the geographic location of economic activity. Regional shares of net commodity product 1939 to 1940. If you look at the data, by industry, then fishery. So this is kind of the first industry. So it's not real like industrialization kind of things. So 63% is very natural, right? Because South Korea was surrounded by sea, so it's very natural. Agriculture 60%, forestry 53%, manufacturing 46%, mining 24%, total 54%. But if you look at the north, so important thing is manufacturing and mining, right? So these two are the most important in terms of industrialization growth. The 50 manufacturing is 54%. So North Korea has got more. Mining 76%. So and then if you look at the total rate, there's no clear difference between north and south. And manufacturing, if you look at the manufacturing more detailed way, the chemicals like 83% located north, metals 89, ceramics 73, wood product 44, only like I can read food stuffs, so food kind of things. Machine and tool 72, textile 83. So important industrialization growth, important ingredients for industrialization growth, chemicals, metals, ceramics are mostly located in north rather than south. So if Arthur Korea is right, then North Korea should have developed more than South Korea. If if the Japanese colonialism is main cultural variables for the growth, but it's not, right? So this actually showing clearly that what Atukoi is saying is completely wrong. And post-war, so that's what I wanted to actually emphasize to you. Even though everything is right, so even let's say like Atukoi is right completely, but the important thing is whether the Japanese establishment could continue to continuously to lead to Korean development. That means there is, I mean, this article is actually talk about continuity and discontinuity. And then the Hegat arrow wanted to say that there is discontinuity. So I mean, there is huge gaps between the development state and the Japanese colonialism. So Japanese colonialism it started in 1919, 1915 to 1940, 1945, 1910 to 1945, and it's over 1945. And then Korea has suffered from occupation, right? The American occupation. So U.S. occupied for like 5 years, 3 years, and then there was a Korean War, right? And then there was a Lee government and Park Chung-hee government. So Park Chung-hee government actually started to its economy, I mean, its development state. It's like 1960s, but there was a gap, like about 15 years of gap. So how can we explain this 15 years gap, and how can this uh, link to how should we link, if there is any, how should we link the colonialism development strategy to developmental strategy? So it's important thing that I want to emphasize is post-war, and then also U.S. occupation, U.S. how U.S. help. That's also another discontinuities between Japanese colonialism and the development state. So post-war, during the war, what happened? That's very important. The total industrial output in 1948 was of one fifth of the 1940 level. That means what? Like the Korean industrialization, let's say in 1940 was like let's say 100, but it became after the war in 1948 it became like 20%. So 20. That means every industrial things actually went out during the war. That's what they argue. So from June 1945 to December 1949, the number of manufacturing firms decreased by nearly 50%. So even though like Japan, let's say Japan established or built a lot of factories, like according to Arthur Corley, there are about like more than 200 farms, right? So they established, but more than 100 actually went out because of the war. And the employment in manufacturing declined by nearly 60%, falling from 352 to 122, 159. So it is not easy to say just because this number has left. This would contribute to development state, transformations of development state. And the departure of Japanese was important cause of post-war economy, vacuum in external economic relations. So Japanese government was hold this external economy relations. So as I explained, the Japan export a lot, right? About like rice, they export rice, a lot of manufacturing things to the outside, but they lost completely this external economy relations because Japan went out and they do not, uh, the other partners they do not no longer has a relationship with South Korean government. And then you should also to look at the war damage. Total damage were 412 billion won. So at the time, the instead of won, we use won. Instead instead of won, at the time they use won. So 412 billion won, almost two times South Korea's total national production in 1950. So 53. So war was over in 1953, and then 1953, the total national production was 229 billion, but war damage was even higher than uh, the national total national production. That means there's nothing to left, right? So first of all, nothing left in the territory, and damage is even higher than what we have. So even though Japan left something, but because of war, nothing has been left, and nothing actually affected to the Korean society per se. And transport infrastructure, that's what the Japanese government, Japanese colonialism, supporters of Japanese colonialism emphasize really high. The transport and infrastructure, what happened, were not the hardest hit, but even though it's old when. So according to the article, the transport and infrastructure was not much left, but it's not. I mean, housing, government facilities, and industry bore the brunt of destruction. So that means, yes, transport infrastructure was not left much, but the even more serious thing is housing, government facilities, and industry. So these are actually the more important things for economic growth, but nothing left. And 43% of manufacturing facilities, 41% of electronic generating capacity, and 50% of total mines in South Korea were destroyed or damaged. So half of them were gone. It doesn't, I mean, so you could still argue that, oh, we still have 50%. That's very positive thinking, way of thinking. But so we can say like, oh, because of 50%, Korea could develop. But if you calculate war damage, the total damage of war, if considering that 50% doesn't really help. And during the 1953 to 60, the U.S. aid became central to Korean economic growth. So we would definitely talk about this. So like 70% of Korean GDP were depends on the U.S. aid. So without U.S. aid, we couldn't survive. Actually, how can I mean which one is more closer? So if we talking about like closer period, then the U.S. aid it's much more closer than development state. I mean, than the Japanese colonialism when we compare the development state, right? So we can say that U.S. aid is more direct, more it has more direct effects on the Korean economic development. That's what we can say. And highly bureaucratic form of government. That's the another thing that the colonial supporters of colonialism argue. The sizable cadre of Japanese trained bureaucrats virtually took over the day-to-day running of truncated South Korea. So that's why they saying. So we trained a lot of bureaucrats of Koreans, and then these people became like developmental states. They played a significant role during the Japanese colonialism. If it is right, then they were at least 20s, 30s, right? For when they were the Japanese colonialists, because at least you need like 5 years training. So let's say like you were at least 20 years old when you in 1940, right? And then you have got trained like 5 years, then you would be 25 years, and then the Japanese development state started like 1960, let's say 1960, then you should be at least like 40 years old, right? So it's possible, and theoretically it's possible. So under the colonial governor general, the highest bureaucrat rank was Shinnin. So Shinnin, it's Japanese, so it's not even Korean. So Shinnin was highest bureaucrat ranking, but there was no Korean. They did not appoint any Shinnin position to Korean. So there was no Korean. So no Koreans could not directly learn how to organize things. So because like ranking should be like governor general ranking to organize things, but there was no Korean for that position. The next ranking was Jokunin, and below ranking is Sonnin. But 55% Koreans were appointed as Jokunin, and a lot of people were appointed as Sonnin. But 55 Koreans, do you think that is very effective? So only 55, there were only 55 Korean people. They must be very old because the rank was very high. So they couldn't be. I believe there must be to have that ranking, two positions that rank. You should be at least like 40 or more than 40. So that means you will be 55 like when you have a development stage. But it's not easy for 55 age of 55 work really hard. So it's not very plausible. But the extent of continuity in personnel between the Japanese and post-independence period has almost certainly been exaggerated. So that's what they're saying. So there, the like Atsu Korea keeps saying like there was continuity because of these trained Koreans they left, and that they actually worked really hard. But I wanted to emphasize one thing that they saying the reformers did not experience in colonial bureaucracy. So there were four major reformers. They were all 36 years. Their average age was 36 years old. So this is actually showing that they did not have enough experience in colonial bureaucracy, but still they could participate in reforming. So the Japanese colonialism really did not necessary for the reform. And the most important institutional innovation of the Park period, the creation of the Economic Planning Board, has no parallel whatsoever in Japan nor in the Japanese colonial administration. We will definitely learn creation of the Economic Planning Board. So the how Korea could develop, because we have a like specific development strategy, and then and policy, industrialization policies, and where this industrialization policy came from. It came from Economic Planning Board, and the Economic Planning Board does not resemble at all of from the Japanese colonialism. So that's what they are talking about. And oh, I didn't finish it. Also, the next thing is this. So, increase state capacity. So this one, you're talking about like 재벌. So Korean, this one, I did not write finish one. I didn't finish it yet, so I want to write this. So if you look at page page 875. So it's saying that they started to talk about like Korean entrepreneurships. So Korean entrepreneurship actually started in 1876 on Korea. So the emergence of native entrepreneurial class that eventually turned its attention to industry. Far from stifling such gross colonialism advances, the Japanese permitted the development of native bourgeoisie class. So that's what I want you to actually write it here. But I want you to emphasize. I mean, the Hekadero. I want to actually emphasize this, like growth of Jebel. So Jebel actually plays significant roles for economic growth in Korean economic growth. So if you have known a little knowledge about Korea, you probably like talking about like what is big conglomerates in Korea, like Jebel, big conglomerates such as Samsung, Hyundai, like LG. These are big conglomerates in Korea, and then they actually accounted for about like 50% of Korean economy. That means these play very significant roles for increased Korean economic growth. And then the Hekgader are actually showing that these jables also showing discontinuity from Japanese colonialism to the development state. So if you look at the jebol, the 50 largest jebol in 1983, that's table number 7. So this is the picture. If you look at it pre 1910, there was only one group. And from 1910 to 44, so it must be a very significant period of time because this is colonialism. And there were seven firms, top 50, 6, top 10, 1. 1955, top 10 is 1, top 50 is 5. So they actually show what they are. So this is one Gyeongbang. Gyeongbang was established by Korean landowners. And traditional commercial Dusan. You probably heard of Dusan. Dusan still survived. And the new farms of Hashin, Gongshin, and Baeksan. You probably never heard Hwasin, Gongshin, and Baeksan. And Gyeongbang and Dusan were not major exporters. So they actually followed import substitution. So Jaeber, how could they survive? Because they followed export-oriented policy. But Gyeongbang and Dusan were not major exporters. So we should consider them as outsider. The three others, so Hwasin, Gongshin, and Baeksan, all went bankruptcy in 1960s. So they couldn't play any roles for development states. So development states started in 1960, but they went bankruptcy in 1960s. So then they had no chance to contribute economic developmental states. So that's what he's saying. So it's very when they argue, they showing, see, this is the evidence that I wanted to show to you to persuade you. This and evidence was very clear, and he's showing that this is I mean, when you read article, you might say, "Oh yeah, article is right," and he's very persuasive. But if you look at Hekgader, you can never agree on article, right? And then coordinate the social and subordinate classes in Korean model. So the Japanese the Japanese colonialism, so supporters of Japanese colonialism argue that like landowners should have worked, right, during the Japanese rule, and then this actually transformed Korean agriculture, and then this also contributes to social equality in Korea, and the labor repressive and export-oriented policies they all use or contribute for later development. We will learn labor repressive policies during the developmental period, and then export-oriented were selected by Park Jong-il for sure. But you should actually know that the first president of Lee Sung-man, he did not choose or select export-oriented policy at all. So there was also discontinuity. And the reporting system